All right, and I think we are live. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ninth annual Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities. This is the third concurrent session, and my name is Vivek Ravichandran, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, and I'll be leading this workshop entitled Creating an Environmental Justice, or EJ Scorecard, Holding Legislators Accountable. So, what are the objectives of an environmental justice or EJ scorecard? Well, you want to take a deeper dive into the legislators' voting records, whether it's at the federal scale or the state level, or even the local level and municipality scale in regards to environmental justice bills or initiatives. By doing so, you can begin to determine who the EJ champions are, and on the flip side, who the EJ antagonists, quote unquote, are, whom you may want to engage in further discussions and conversations. You can engage them through qualitative methods such as focus groups or even semi-structured interviews to identify what barriers and challenges might exist towards developing EJ legislation or passing EJ legislation or voting in favor of EJ legislation. Lastly, EJ scorecards in general are a phenomenal metric to track progress over time, both overall as a legislature or chamber, or individually per legislature or per legislator. So I want to begin by briefly contextualizing environmental justice. While EJ refers to the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations, pollution levels in America still follow social demographic lines. In fact, what's bolded here truly resonated with me as a student, and that is that zip code is still the most potent predictor of an individual's health and well being. We see this with asthma rates and life expectancy, where within a city like Washington, D.C., life expectancy can differ by 20 years. And those who live on, quote, the wrong side of the tracks are subjected to disproportionate levels of environmental pathogens and preventable diseases. And I wanted to briefly cite Dr. Robert Bullard for part of this quote, and he is known as the father of the environmental justice movement. So, to combat some of these effects, President Biden introduced the Justice 40 initiative, which is what our EJ scorecard is centered around, into his executive order on climate change. This executive order allocates 40% of benefits from federal investments to go towards disadvantaged communities. Now, in Maryland and other similarly situated states, bills have been introduced or passed that define a disadvantaged or overburdened or even an environmental justice community. I want to give a special shout out to Senator Arthur Ellis from Maryland, who first introduced this form of legislation for the state. In Maryland, we have the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool, and this allows us to pinpoint areas of specific investment. EJ advocates gathered and identified key EJ values and benefits that Justice 48 investments should deliver to EJ communities. And those fall under the categories that you see here. So you have healthy communities and pollution reduction, climate justice and resilience, a just transition, and allowing communities to speak for themselves. The last component is one of the key pillars of environmental justice, which is the meaningful involvement of community members throughout policy, the policy stream, and other forms of decision making. When crafting a scorecard, you don't want to, reinvent the wheel. Perhaps you just want to fine tune that wheel, so to speak. So you want to see what's already been done, what's already been developed, and what results that you found. So at the state level, the California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA, as well as our Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health, we've prepared a scorecard. These two entities have prepared scorecards for the state of California and the state of Maryland and their legislatures accordingly. And so here are some key results from the 2022 CEJA scorecard. So presented here are 3 EJ champions and a description of some of the bills that they've introduced or voted in favor of. For example, Assemblymember Isaac Bryan has partnered with Frontline Community, so he's been very much engaged with fence-line communities, and he helped create a buffer zone of 3,000 feet between oil and gas wells and vulnerable sites, like homes, schools, hospitals, and playgrounds. Therefore, these three individuals, based on their initiatives, their legislation that they've co-authored or introduced, and their engagement with the community, have allowed them to earn the title of EJ champions. And so this is actually our very own siege scorecard for the state of Maryland for the years 2019 to 2021. What we observed is that the EJ scores, the voting scores, followed a partisan line. And this suggests a further conversation about the politics of environmental health. Now, I don't want to dive too deeply into this, but we did find that the top 10 EJ legislators, in Maryland were all Democrat. I want to emphasize there was a three-way tie for third place. So these are the percentiles in this chart. Rosenberg, Henson, and Washington all had the highest scores. They were all Democrats. So this again gets into the idea of using qualitative methods to follow up with these scores. So not just identifying who is an antagonist, but realizing how you can have conversations with them, allow them to express their views, and figure out how to circumnavigate barriers towards EJ initiatives at the state level. So up next, I'm going to go ahead and share our own methodology for the creation of the Legislator Scorecard for the 2022 to 2023 session. The process begins with a key EJ term search on the Maryland General Assembly website. This is shown to the right. These terms were based off of the WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council's scorecard recommendations. And I have a slide next that showcases the key search terms that we used. Bills that contained elements of EJ were kept, and we determined whether a vote in favor of that bill was a vote for or against environmental justice. This process was repeated by another member of our team to check for inter-rater reliability. So here we observe the key search terms that were indeed deployed for the scorecard. So you see a lot of, pathogenic features like food deserts, food insecurity, land use, zoning, etc. But we also wanted to focus on salutogenic features like the built environment, green spaces, parks, and other factors. And I wanted to just present our decision tree in a more visual format. So the first step is, again, to look at bills that contain search terms and then screen them for contextual relevance. Just because a bill contains the word, say, environment or environmental justice does not indicate that it is an EJ bill. So we need to be diligent about that. So, if they did not contain the contextual relevance, they were discarded from the analysis. Once they passed the initial screening, where we had a second reviewer of our team identify if they were indeed EJ bills, we placed them into tiers. And this happened through a conversation with our director, Dr. Wilson. We placed them into 3 tiers: high, medium, and low priority. Bills that were considered low priority were subsequently withdrawn from the analysis. Just want to check the chat to see if there are any questions. And folks who are viewing on the YouTube live stream, or Facebook Live, feel free to post any questions you might have in the chat, the comment section, and I will boost that to my screen at the conclusion of the presentation. Thank you. So the voting records for the bills were obtained from the bill history page. So we looked at those who voted in favor or against said bill. And then we used a Python script that generates an overall mean score for each legislator. For example, if the legislator voted in favor of 10 EJ bills and had 10 voting opportunities, they would receive a score of 100. If they voted in favor of 9 EJ bills and had 10 opportunities, they would receive a 90%. Additionally, those who voted in favor of high priority bills were awarded double the points so that we could start to weigh their scores accordingly. And so on this slide, we have the overall breakdown, the overall methodology. So legislators were awarded an additional point if they introduced or co-sponsored a medium or high priority EJ bill as well. So over here, we have the three formulas. We have the medium priority score and the high priority score. And the aggregated score was simply the medium priority and the high priority score with the co-sponsor bonus divided by the total voting opportunities. As you can probably tell, it was indeed possible for a legislator to receive a score above 100%. Therefore, all the scores that were then converted into a final percentile in order for us to standardize the scoring process. And this is just a quick tip. When producing results, it's important that you produce an overall legislative summary table by branch. So we want to look at the House versus Senate. We also want to aggregate, or I should say, stratify by party. Democrat versus Republican versus Independent. So you can start to produce cross-tabular reports and really get a feel for where the EJ antagonists might lie and where your EJ champions might lie. You want to produce a top 10 overall table, and out of the top 10, you want to identify the top 3 that were EJ champions, and you want to be able to look into their profiles, look into the news articles, news reports, and see what they've done to become EJ champions. So did they have any initiatives? Did they take the lead? How was their community engagement, et cetera, et cetera? So additionally, when you're creating a scorecard, this is normally done for multiple years. So this scorecard that I'm presenting the results for you for soon is for the years 2022 to 2023. So if you have a scorecard, you want it to be iterative. So you want to look at progress over 5 years. Who's trending up? Who's trending down? Because if you have EJ antagonists, but you engage with them through qualitative methods, interviews, focus groups, whatever it is, and you're able to have an impact, that will be seen by the trend line, by an increase and a boost in their score over 5 years. So that gets into my next slide here. I'm making the process iterative, and you want to learn from limitations of previous scorecards. For example, in 2020, the COVID pandemic shut down the 2020 legislative session. There were only a few voting opportunities, and this really skewed the results and limited the statistical power of our findings. So you want to have contingency plans in place to prepare for such extreme circumstances. For example, rather than only focusing on bills and votes, why not focus on the initiatives that were taken? For example, during COVID, you might want to take a look at how legislators were taking initiatives for COVID-19 relief mitigation, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, climate resilience and other topics. And that's obviously subject for further conversation, and we can talk about this additionally during the Q&A. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into the results from the Siege scorecard for 2022 to 2023. So when considering bills that illustrate the complexities of EJ, environmental justice within the state during the study period, 2022-2023, SB 0528 stands out as a prime example. This was passed during the 2022 session, and it's considered to be one of the most ambitious emission reduction targets, with a special focus here on buildings. The bill was sponsored by Senator Paul Pinsky. And what this bill did is it set the nation's leading interim goal of a 60% reduction below the 2006 emissions by the year 2031, so in 8 years, and a requirement to reach net zero by the year 2045. And these are just some secondary initiatives that have been required or recommended in order for Maryland to accomplish such a feat. Another key issue is the DC's proposal to build a bus yard facility in the town of Cheverly, Maryland. I'm not sure how many of you on the YouTube and Facebook stream attended the Cheverly air quality monitoring session, but this was touched upon during that session, where the town of the community of Cheverly is already overburdened by various dirty facilities, And a series of letters were written to DC by the Maryland Department of the Environment and the general public dating back to May of last year. There have been a few private political meetings about the matter, but there have been limited meetings that included residents. So there again was a limited meaningful involvement of the community members. And again, this violates one of the core tenets of environmental justice. So yeah, although the emissions are not exclusively to blame for the air pollution, it's the larger system of environmental racism which deteriorates human health, environmental health, and raises the stakes for policy decisions related to such facilities. So permitting, zoning, et cetera, and the identification of environmental justice communities through legislation so that they can be protected. So with the formula that I presented and some of these key bills and environmental health issues going on in Maryland, these were our top 10 legislators. And as you can see, they again have that partisan divide. So the top 10 were all Democrats. In this case, the top 10 all resided within the House. And then we'll touch base on the EJ, the top three as EJ champions shortly. And then here we have the bottom 10 legislators in Maryland. And as you can see, there's a similar pattern that is observed where the majority were Republican. So overall, as I mentioned, we seem to see a partisan divide as the top 10 EJ legislators were all Democrats, and they had voted overwhelmingly in favor of EJ bills compared to the Republican counterparts. And the top performing EJ champions are Delegate Regina T. Boyce, Delegate Dana M. Stein, and Delegate David Fraser Hidalgo. And now we're going to go into some of the EJ highlights for each of them. So Delegate Boyce currently serves as the vice chair of the Environmental and Transportation Committee, and she's a member of the EJ Commission. She's co-sponsored a variety of EJ-related bills, so that's really where you see her voting score take a quick rise. I don't want to dive into each of them, but there's just so many, and I've listed the acronyms here. And she was a sole sponsor of HB 840, and this required the Maryland Department of the Environment to conduct cumulative impact assessments prior to the approval of certain environmental permits. Next up, we have Delegate Dana M. Stein. Delegate Stein serves as the vice chair of the Environmental and Transportation Committee alongside Delegate Boyce, and he's also the chair of the Environmental Subcommittee of the Environmental and Transportation Committee. He co-sponsored HB 1033, and this required the MDE to require at least 40% of the overall spending to benefit overburdened communities. So this again is really resemblant of the Justice 40 initiative and scaling the federal, the executive order to the state level. And because this particular scorecard revolves around Justice 40, this was very imperative and very important to boost in Delegate Stein's score. He also has a very impressive public service background. So he was on the Chesapeake Bay Commission, the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. So he really has a great background in both climate justice, environmental justice, and overall public health. And so last, but certainly not least, is Delegate David Fraser Hidalgo. Delegate Fraser Hidalgo serves on the Economic Matters Committee, and he's also a chair of the Maryland Legislative Latino Caucus. And one of his notable co-sponsored EJ bills include the carbon emissions reduction and the climate crisis planning. He also co-sponsored or sponsored HB 147, which requires each county to produce a climate crisis plan to address the effects of climate change within the county. And one requirement of each of these plans is to look at the impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities specifically. He also, which is not mentioned here, he had also introduced a bill to expand the ambient air monitoring program in Maryland, which requires the Maryland Department of the Environment to own and operate an additional set of air monitors. And he's worked closely with our team to discuss the placement of low-cost sensors to supplement the air monitoring program and really provide a hyper-local and high-resolution view of air quality throughout the state. And last, before we get into the Q&A, because this is a relatively shorter session, I wanted to just extend a special thank you to the 2023 cohort of SIEGE, so our Environmental Justice Summer Scholars Program. Specific names mentioned here. They were really instrumental in developing this scorecard, and of course, just want to say this workshop would not be possible without their contributions. So that's really all I had for the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and like to see if there are any questions from the chat at this time. I'll kind of stay on for a few more minutes to allow folks to add their questions. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and put my email in the chat for anyone who's viewing so that you can contact me for the slides or any questions you might have about the scorecard and how it can be refined for future iterations. So there is my email address, and I want to thank everyone viewing from YouTube and Facebook Live for coming in and learn about our scorecard. And I hope everybody enjoys the close-in plenary that we have. And that close-in plenary begins at 4:30 p.m. and is entitled Environmental Justice and Economic Empowerment with an IN, a financial roundtable on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So again, thank you so much, and I'll see you at the plenary.